Imagine being a user of your own life, not an owner, not a stakeholder, a user. You don't own your software. You rent access to it on a monthly plan that can be revoked the moment you stop paying. You don't own your car. You lease the experience of driving it. And when the lease is up, you have nothing to show for 3 years of payments except the option to start over. You don't own your education. You carry a debt obligation that collects interest while you sleep. And now the final pillar is falling: the home. The middle class is not going broke. It is being harvested. And if that sentence just hit differently than you expected, stick around. I'm Clara. This is Clara Explains Finance. And if you're new here, subscribe. We trace systems, not symptoms. Now let's get into it. We were handed a map. We followed it. We arrived at the destination, and the floor had been liquidated and sold back to us on a monthly plan. Today, we follow the fingerprints from the credential that started you in debt to the algorithm repricing your neighborhood to the exhaustion that makes sure you never have the energy to read the receipts. This is the unmasking of the permanent tenant class. The lie was elegant. It said, education is an asset. It said, the degree is the ticket. It said, invest in yourself, take on the debt, and the return will justify the cost. For a specific window of time, roughly 1950 to 1985, that was approximately true. A college degree opened a relatively reliable gateway to employment that paid enough to service whatever modest debt had been incurred and still build toward stability. The credential and the return were calibrated to each other. Then the calibration broke, and it broke in a specific direction by a specific mechanism that nobody announced. The modern university did not transform into a debt delivery system by accident. It transformed because the funding model changed. As state governments progressively reduced per-student subsidies to public universities across the 1980s and 1990s, institutions faced a choice: reduce their cost structure or find alternative revenue. They found alternative revenue. Federal student loan guarantees meant that tuition could rise and students would still enroll because the debt was accessible, because the cultural mandate for credentials was intensifying, and because the consequences of that debt were sufficiently deferred, 4 years of education, then decades of repayment, that the true cost never landed at the moment of decision. The result is a number that should stop anyone in their tracks if they actually look at it. The average student loan balance at graduation has increased by over 1,000% in inflation-adjusted terms since 1970. The average starting salary for a bachelor's degree holder has increased by approximately 19% in the same period. The entry fee went up 1,000%. The first paycheck went up 19%. That is not a gap, that is a canyon between cost and return. And the people who built the bridge over that canyon collect a toll on every crossing every month for decades. This is the meritocracy paradox, and it is rarely explained this clearly. We told an entire generation that the only path to the middle class ran through the credential. We made the credential mandatory by pricing every alternative route out of relevance. And then we attached that mandatory credential to a debt instrument that begins extracting before the graduate has earned their first dollar. In the workforce, have you ever wondered why we call it student aid when it functions more like a systemic advance on your future productivity? One that the system collects with interest, regardless of whether the promised returns materialize? By the time you enter the workforce, you are already years behind where your parents stood on day one. They started at zero. You start in the negative, with obligations already waiting. And the system still has the confidence to call this investment. The degree was the first trap. The two-income household was the second. And to understand this one, you need a number that almost nobody talks about. In 1971, a single male worker at the median wage earned approximately $54,000 in today's inflation-adjusted dollars. His household, one income, a spouse, 2 or 3 children, had a mortgage payment that consumed roughly 18% of that gross income. Federal and state taxes consumed perhaps 22%. The remaining 60%, approximately $32,000 in today's terms, was available for everything else: food, transportation, clothing, savings, emergencies, discretionary spending. That was the breathing room. That 60% was what made a single flat tire or an unexpected medical bill an inconvenience rather than a crisis. Combined income of $120,000, which sounds like almost double, but tell that to the math. The mortgage payment on the median-priced home in a market with access to decent employment consumes between 30 and 40% of that gross income. Federal, state, and payroll taxes consume roughly 28%. Childcare, which did not exist as a major budget line in 1971, consumes 10 to 15%. Because one parent was available, the remaining 17 to 22% is what is left. For everything else, for two people working two jobs, that is the breathing room. It shrank from 60% to 20%, and it required twice the labor to produce. The liberation of the dual income household was real. It was also immediately monetized. The moment every household had two earners, the economy repriced the inputs of middle-class life to absorb the new income. Housing in desirable areas doubled in real cost because two incomes could service the larger mortgage. Childcare industrialized and repriced to capture the income of the parent who had previously provided it without market compensation. The tax burden increased because a second income is taxed at higher marginal rates. The convenience economy expanded to sell solutions to the time scarcity that two working parents now experienced. Every additional dollar of capacity was met with an additional dollar of extraction. The treadmill did not get faster by accident. It was redesigned to ensure constant motion, that standing still requires both feet moving at maximum speed. Why is it that two professionals with advanced degrees in 2026 feel more financially fragile than a single factory worker felt in 1968? That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a mathematical outcome, and the mathematics were not inevitable. They were chosen. Now we arrive at the centerpiece, the home, the physical anchor of the middle-class identity. The thing we were told, above all else, represented security. And to understand what happened to it, we need to sit with a specific scenario, one that happens to hundreds of thousands of people every year and almost never gets named for what it is. You buy a house, $350,000. You put down 20%, $70,000 years of savings, the largest single financial commitment of your life. Your mortgage is $280,000 at a 6.5% interest rate, 30 years. Your monthly payment is approximately $1,770. You make that payment every month, on time, for 10 years. You have paid $212,400 into that loan over a decade. You sit down one evening and pull up your mortgage statement, and you discover that your outstanding principal, the amount you still owe, is $240,000. You have paid $212,400 and reduced your debt by $40,000. The other $172,400, 81 cents of every dollar you paid over 10 years went to interest, to the bank, not to your equity, not to your future. To the institution that lent you the money and structured the repayment to ensure they collected their profit before you collected your ownership. This is the amortization trap. And it is not a bug in the mortgage system. It is the system working exactly as designed. The word amortization itself comes from the Latin for killing off, the gradual killing of the debt. But in the early years, the debt barely dies. The interest front-loading is built into the mathematical structure of every standard 30-year mortgage. In year one, roughly 90% of every payment is interest. By year 15, the split begins to approach 50-50. The equity accumulation is heavily weighted to the back half of the loan, the half most borrowers never reach, because the average American moves or refinances every 7 to 10 years. Refinancing resets the clock. Every time you refinance, to lower your rate, to pull out equity, to consolidate other debt, you return to year one of the amortization schedule. You return to the period where 90% of your payment is interest. The bank does not lose when you refinance. The bank wins. They have already collected several years of front-loaded interest, and now they begin collecting it again from a new starting point. They have successfully converted your greatest asset into a recurring subscription, one that you can upgrade, extend, and recommit to, but never quite finish paying. The terminology matters here too. Mortgage, from the Old French mort gage, death pledge, a pledge that lasts until death or discharge. We made a death pledge the foundational instrument of middle-class aspiration, and then built a tax code that rewards maintaining the debt and provides no benefit for eliminating it. The mortgage interest deduction gives you a tax break proportional to how much interest you are paying. The more interest you pay, the larger the benefit. There is no equivalent benefit for paying off the loan. The choice architecture steers you at every junction back toward the debt. A paid-off home is a dead asset to the financial system. A homeowner with no mortgage is a consumer who has escaped one of the most reliable extraction mechanisms in the economy. The system does not reward that escape. It makes it structurally difficult, tax inefficient in the short term, and culturally unsupported. How much of your homeownership is actually just a high-end rental agreement with the bank, one where you also bear the costs of maintenance, property tax, and depreciation that a renter never touches? While you were navigating the amortization schedule, competing in the dual income treadmill, and servicing the Credential debt, a new participant entered the housing market, one with capabilities you were never designed to compete against. The institutional buyer, the private equity firm, the real estate investment trust, the hedge fund with a residential strategy did not come to find a home. They came to build a portfolio. And the yield mechanics they operate on are categorically different from anything a family with a pre-approval letter can deploy. Here is how the yield optimization actually works, because this is not simply corporations buying houses. This is a software problem being solved at scale. The largest institutional landlords operate proprietary algorithms that monitor rental market data across entire metropolitan areas in real time. These systems track vacancy rates, competitor pricing, new listings, income trends, and seasonal demand patterns across every zip code in their portfolio simultaneously. When the algorithm identifies that a specific submarket can absorb a rent increase, that demand is high enough, supply is constrained enough, and tenant mobility is low enough, it flags every unit in that submarket for repricing. Not individual units, every unit simultaneously coordinated across a portfolio of tens of thousands of properties, executing in days what would take a human landlord months to assess. The result is rent increases that are not the product of a landlord deciding to charge more. They are the product of a system that has determined the maximum extractable rent that the market will bear before tenant default rates exceed an acceptable threshold. The algorithm is not asking what is fair. It is solving for yield. And when that yield optimization runs across an entire zip code simultaneously, when every institutional landlord in a market is running a version of the same repricing logic, the effect on rent levels is not the result of competition. It is the result of coordination through shared information architecture. This is why the housing affordability crisis feels permanent in a way that previous housing cycles did not. Previous cycles were driven by interest rates, construction costs, and speculative demand, factors that responded to policy interventions. What is happening now has an additional structural layer that does not respond to interest rate adjustments. The institutional rental inventory does not go on sale when rates rise. The fund does not need to sell. It can wait. It has liquidity that no family, no individual investor, and no policy instrument is currently equipped to match. The starter home was not priced out of reach by the market. It was purchased by entities whose business model requires that it never return to the ownership pool. Every house in that portfolio is a former opportunity for a family to begin building equity. Every house in that portfolio is now a permanent revenue line. The math of that trade for the institution is simple. For the family that can no longer enter the ownership economy, the consequences compound across a generation. There is one more mechanism, the one that makes all of the others sustainable. Because a system this extractive, this visible in its outcomes, should generate the kind of resistance that forces structural change. And yet, for the most part, it generates something else. It generates a specific bone-level exhaustion that looks like acceptance and functions like compliance. The exhaustion economy is not a metaphor. It is a designed condition with measurable inputs and predictable outputs. The inputs are maximum utilization of available labor hours at income levels insufficient to generate meaningful savings. The output is a consumer population with insufficient cognitive resources to audit, resist, or exit the extraction systems they are embedded in. A tired person is an expensive person. Not expensive to themselves, expensive to the system that feeds on their spending decisions. When you have been working 50 hours a week to maintain a middle-class position that your parents maintained on 35, you arrive home with a specific neurological deficit. Decision fatigue is not a personality trait. It is a documented physiological state in which the quality of decision-making degrades in direct proportion to the number of decisions previously made. The brain's capacity for deliberate, effortful choice is finite and depletes across the day. By the time you are home at 7 in the evening, your deliberate decision-making system is running on reserve power, and every extraction mechanism in the modern economy is optimized for exactly that window. You do not have the energy to cook. So you order delivery and pay a 30% markup on the food, plus the delivery fee, plus the platform fee, plus the tip, for a meal that costs 3 times what it would have cost you 45 minutes of cooking to produce. You do not have the bandwidth to review your insurance renewal, so you accept the automatic increase. You do not notice the subscription that renewed at the higher tier. You do not comparison shop the cell plan, the internet provider, the electricity rate. You do not audit the recurring charges on your credit card statement with the attention they would receive if you were arrested and had an hour to spend. You pay the convenience premium, the premium that exhausted people pay simply to make fewer decisions, and that premium flows upward. The decompression tax is the aggregate of those premiums. Every dollar spent because you were too tired to spend it optimally. Every subscription maintained because canceling requires decisions you do not have left. Every prepackaged, pre-cooked, pre-decided consumption choice that costs more than the alternative you would have made if you had the time and energy to make it. Individually, each charge is defensible. Collectively, they represent hundreds of dollars a month in outflow, with no corresponding accumulation of anything you own or control. And here's the closure of the loop that makes this a system rather than a coincidence. The same economic pressure that generates the exhaustion also generates the income insufficiency that makes the convenience spending feel necessary. You work longer hours because the income from standard hours is insufficient. The longer hours generate exhaustion. The exhaustion generates convenience spending. The convenience spending increases your monthly outflow. The increased outflow makes the income insufficiency worse, which requires more hours, which generates more exhaustion. They need the middle class to be too tired to cook, too tired to audit the bills, too tired to attend the city council meeting where zoning policy gets made, too tired to research the institutional investor buying 3 houses on their street, too tired to organize, to advocate, to demand structural change to the mechanisms that are extracting from them. Exhaustion is not a side effect of the system. It is a deliverable. A population at maximum utilization with zero discretionary energy is a population that will pay whatever the system charges for relief and never have the capacity to ask why the relief is necessary. So you have paid the credential tax, run the dual income treadmill, signed the death pledge, watched the institutional buyer outbid you in cash, paid the decompression tax every exhausted evening, and you are still holding on to the belief that the equity in your home represents something real, something that proves the system worked, even a little, even for you. Look at the numbers carefully. When your home's nominal value increases by 40% over a decade, that looks like wealth. It feels like winning. But every other home in your market also increased. If you sell, you buy back into the same inflated system. The gain is not transferable to a different market without corresponding loss. The only people who consistently extract real value from nominal appreciation are the bank, who collects transaction fees and origination costs on the next purchase, the government, who collects higher property taxes on the new assessed value, and the realtor, who takes 6 to 10% of the sale price at the transaction point. You are running up a down escalator. The steps beneath your feet are moving. You are working hard enough to stay on the same step and interpreting that as progress. The equity illusion is the most important psychological mechanism in the entire architecture because it keeps the people most systematically disadvantaged by the system defending it against criticism, against alternatives, against the structural analysis that would reveal the escalator for what it is. The middle class is not disappearing because people stopped working hard. It is disappearing because the unit of measure has been compromised. The currency devalues, the nominal numbers grow. The real purchasing power, the actual claim on goods, services, time, and security that a dollar represents, shrinks. And the people watching their account balances increase in nominal terms are told they are building wealth while the real value of that wealth is systematically harvested. There is no life hack for a structural condition. There is no budget category that offsets an architecture. You cannot individually optimize your way out of a system that was specifically designed to absorb individual optimization and convert it into additional extraction. What is available is something more fundamental and more difficult. It is the realization that seeing the system clearly is not the end of the investigation. It is the beginning. Digital decolonization, the reclamation of attention, of deliberate choice, of the cognitive sovereignty that the exhaustion economy specifically targets, is not a wellness practice. It is the precondition for any thinking that has a chance of being yours rather than the system's. The goal of the architecture we have traced today is total integration, a world where the credential is a subscription, the home is a conditional tenancy, the car is a lease, the entertainment is a service, the food is a delivery, and the exhausted human at the center of all of it never has enough breathing room to ask who designed this and why. They want your compliance to be automatic. They need it to be. Because a clear-eyed, rested person who understands the mechanics of what is happening to them is the one participant the system was not built to handle. The system is not broken. It is operating exactly as designed. And designs have architects, and architects, when enough people learn to read their blueprints, can be held accountable for what they built. That reading starts here, and it starts now.